Hey everybody, it's Mrs. Dugan. Today we're going to be talking about how to interpret graphs. So if you remember, when we're analyzing our data, the best way to analyze our data is through graphs. We need to put our data into a graph. Now, we've talked about three different types of graphs. We've talked about bar graphs, line graphs, and circle graphs. Today we're going to really focus in and hone into interpreting a bar graph. So if you see on the screen, I have a bar graph that's titled Numbers of Times Annoyed Per Day. Now, I personally have collected data on how many times my family members have annoyed me throughout the day. As you can see on the far left side, we have the family members, and then we have the number of times annoyed per day. Now, we could look at the data table and we could interpret it that way, but it's much easier to have a visual representation. So if you remember and think back to when we were studying the scientific method, what did we say goes in the first column of the data table? We said that the first column is always the independent variable. I'm going to highlight that in yellow. So we remember yellow is independent variable. Now, all of the data columns after that are going to be our dependent variable because they depend on the independent variable. Okay, so after I put it into Excel, I created this nice little graph. Okay, and on this graph, we can see that we have an X and Y axis. Now think back again to the PowerPoint that we've talked about and to our lessons on independent and dependent variables. What goes on the X axis? What goes on the X axis? Now remember, X can change. What changes? What do we have control over? What can we change? We can change the independent variable. So the x-axis is always going to be the independent variable. I'm going to highlight that in yellow so we always remember that the x-axis is the independent variable. Okay? Now we look over at the y-axis. What goes on the y-axis? What are we measuring? What are we observing? On the y-axis, it's always going to be the dependent variable. So I'm going to highlight that in blue so we remember that it's the dependent variable. Now, the first thing that we always want to find out is what is the subject of the graph? What is this graph even saying? The way that you can find what the graph is talking about is the title. So this right here, this bolded part, the number of times annoyed per day. I'm going to put that in red so we know that red is title. Your title is what is going to tell you what the heck is this graph even showing us. If we didn't have a title, we wouldn't know. Maybe we could guess, but we probably would be wrong. The next part that we need to look at is identifying again, what is our dependent variable, our independent variable? That is always on what axis? The independent variable is always on the x-axis. It's the thing that we change. So in this case, we look down and we can see that the x-axis is all about family members. So it's the different people in my family. Now, after we find out what the independent variable is, we need to find out, okay, what are we measuring? That's great that we have an independent variable, but what are we actually trying to see? And then we look over to the y-axis. And the y-axis in this case is the times that each family member annoyed me per day. Okay? So we now know what we're measuring and we now know what we are changing. Okay, so now we're really going to get into that data part. We're going to look for the highest bar. So in this case, the highest bar corresponds with Cookie, who's my dog. Okay, and we can see that Cookie has annoyed me 40 times per day, 45 times per day. Now we need to look at the lowest. Who has annoyed me the least? We can see that it's Beth. Beth is my mom. So what can we see? What do we see from this relationship? Okay, what do we see? We can make some guesses, but we also need to think, what is the range of our data? Now, the range is not just our intervals on the y-axis. It's not the intervals. It's actually looking at the data, so these bars. We're looking at the lowest bar and the highest bar. So the range of our data would be 2 times per day to 45 times per day. Let's put it out here. So our range is 2 to 45 times per day. And I'm going to fill that in with, let's do orange. That's our range. Now we need to see what is the source? Is this a credible source? Now, since I collected this personally, the source is going to be Mrs. Dugan's database. So that's where we got all of our information. We'll put that in green. Now, at this point, we're going to see if there's any patterns. Are there any patterns? Are there important things that we need to realize? What can we glean from this information? Well, we can see, first of all, that Beth annoyed me the least. So that's something that we've noticed. Let's put our observations in purple. So Beth annoyed Mrs. Dugan the least. Okay? And we also know that Cookie annoyed Mrs. Dugan the most. What else can we compare? We can compare Evelyn to Jamie. So Evelyn and Jamie annoyed me almost the same. Those are our observations that we can see in our data. When we're looking at our data, we're really trying to see what is the highest, what is the lowest, and what's that middle ground? Is there anything that we can compare? If we look at the two males in this, we can see that Cole and Gary do not have as high as numbers as Cookie, Evelyn, and Jamie. Maybe we can say that the males have lower numbers than some of the females. Okay. When we're looking at data, we need to make sure that we are using very specific and very objective reasoning. Not reasoning, but words, okay? We're not interpreting the data yet. We're just saying, what do we see, not why do we see it, okay? For example, when we say the males have lower numbers than some of the females, that's very different than, well, Miss Dugan isn't annoyed by males compared to females. That would be interpreting. Saying that the numbers are lower is different than Mrs. Dugan doesn't get annoyed by males. Now what we're going to do is we are going to summarize. So what do we know about this graph? When we summarize, we are making sure we're using complete sentences and that we are we're really showing, we're trying to give a picture, we're trying to paint a picture with our words about what the graph is all about. So let's start off. So what do we know? This graph shows how many times a day Miss Dugan is annoyed by her family members. So this graph shows how many times Miss Dugan gets annoyed with her family members. We know the independent variable is what? Our independent variable is always on the x-axis, so the independent variable is family member. And the dependent variable is what? That's always on the y-axis. So the dependent variable is the times that they annoy Mrs. Dugan per day. we know what the range is. The range of the data, move my head out of the way. The range data is 2 times per day to 45 times per day. Okay, so right now we have said what it's about, what the independent and the dependent variables are, and we're also talking about the range so that they know what the lowest point is and the highest point. Okay, now we're going to say any of the patterns that we see, any of our observations. So we know the graph shows Beth annoyed Mrs. Dugan the least, and Cookie annoyed Mrs. Dugan the most. Jamie and Evelyn have similar values. And Gary and Cole have annoyed Miss Dugan annoyed Miss Dugan less than Jamie and Evelyn did. Okay, so that is our summary. Right here is where you are telling people what they know, what you know from your graph. This is going to help people understand your data. Okay, so remember, you always want to look for the independent and the dependent variable first. You want to figure out what is being measured and what is being changed. You also need to figure out what the graph is about. Make sure that you have that title. If you don't have a title, someone might not know what you're trying to measure. If you want more practice, you can go on to our interpreting graphs and we can work together to finish that. Now, if you have any other questions, feel free to review this video and review the PowerPoint that we talked on the last video. Have a great day, guys.